Alright guys, how's it going? I love science and I love technology, and the reason for that is it gives us a glimpse into our futures. And I also love history, as history is a record of how we got here in the first place. So this video is a history of Nvidia GPUs, which will hopefully shed some light on how we got to where we are today. Specifically, this video will cover the entire GeForce series, way back from 1999 and the original GeForce. And my suspicion is that this will be a popular video, and one which introduces new people to my channel. So for that reason, I'm going to go over one or two things that some of you veterans already know about. But for this video, it is extremely important that everybody realizes what is going on. Now, everybody knows that Nvidia makes graphics cards, which is kinda true actually, but not really true. They do make their own graphics cards. That's what the Founders Edition stuff is. And for years they've made their own reference cards. But really, what Nvidia makes is graphics chips. What we now know today as GPUs. It's really their partners who make graphics cards. And Nvidia doesn't really make these chips as such. These chips are made by another company known as TSMC. They're the ones who actually make the chips out of silicon wafers. So Nvidia is really a designer of GPUs. And after the design's finalised, the partner TSMC, they're the ones who actually manufactures the GPUs on what is known as a manufacturing process. Manufacturing processes are otherwise known as nodes and are usually named on size. For example, right now as I make this video, TSMC's most advanced node, their most current manufacturing process, is called 16 nanometers. Way back in 1999, the process size was much larger, 220 nanometers in fact. And that was the manufacturing process that the first GeForce graphics card was built on. So every year or two, this manufacturing process shrinks in size, and each time the process shrinks, it allows for faster, more power efficient GPUs. So hopefully that was easy to understand. Now, Nvidia can make as many GPUs as they can afford to make. And back in 1999, with a brand new GeForce series, otherwise known as GeForce 256, for that series, they created one GPU and gave it the codename NV10. This NV10 GPU had a size of 111 square millimeters, and in that were 23 million transistors. Like I said earlier, it was built on TSMC's 220 nanometer process. So this NV10 GPU became what we knew as a GeForce 256 graphics cards. The original card was GeForce 256 SDR, with the SDR standing for single data rate. This was the first GPU with hardware, transform and lighting. Up until this point, transform and lighting was done in software, and it was much slower. Nvidia was now doing this in hardware, and this rather cheekily made them declare that they had invented the GPU. By their own definition, as we can see here, a GPU is a single chip processor with integrated transform, lighting, triangle setup and clipping, and rendering engines that is capable of processing a minimum of 10 million polygons per second. And it just happened that by this definition, the GeForce was the only graphics processing unit available. There were of course graphics processing units long before Nvidia even existed, but that should give a good indication of how Nvidia sees themselves. They definitely believe that they invented the GPU, and by their own definition of that, it's hard to argue. Now, as far as performance goes, it was 55% faster than the previous generation flagship, which was the Riva TNT2 Ultra. Riva was the branding before GeForce, and with a launch price of $300, most in the press had expected a little bit more than simply 55%. The GeForce 256 was the fastest graphics card, but it wasn't quite as fast as what the expectation was, and one of the main reasons for that was the memory interface. As I mentioned, it was a GeForce 256 SDR. That SDR stands for single data rate memory, and a few months later, when DDR or double data rate memory became available, we saw a performance increase of 17.8%. The same NV10 GPU, only now with the faster DDR memory, saw a very large increase in performance, and it was now everything that the press had expected, at 82.8% faster than the Riva TNT2 Ultra. So think about that, 82.8%, that is a big increase in performance over the previous generation. But that kind of increase was also what was expected back in 1999-2000. However, its high price tag of $300 would keep it out of the hands of many. And for those of you wondering, $300 in the year 2000 would be $426 in 2017. As a flagship GPU, costing $426 with an 83% increase in performance over the previous generation. Right, so next up was the GeForce 2 series, and this time around, instead of designing one single GPU, Nvidia designed multiple GPUs. The largest one, the flagship GPU, was called NV15. and there was also an NV11, which was more suited for the entry level. NV15, however, was only 81 square millimeters in size, well down on the 111 millimeters in size of the GeForce 256, and only had 25 million transistors, compared to the 23 million of the previous GeForce. Now that's actually 2 million more transistors with a smaller size GPU, and the reason for that is, of course, TSMC's manufacturing process. If you remember, the previous GeForce was built on a 220nm process, but the GeForce 2s would now be built using TSMC's 180nm process. You see, this is all a trade-off. A smaller manufacturing process simply means smaller transistors. Smaller transistors use less energy when switching, and that's where the power improvements come from. But you can spend that power improvement by increasing clock speeds, and this is one reason how GPUs get faster. The original GeForce 256 had a core clock speed of 120 MHz, but the new GeForce 2 GTS on the new 180nm process had a core clock speed of 200 MHz. So that's a pretty big increase in the potential performance, even though the number of transistors hasn't changed very much. You might be thinking, why create a smaller GPU in the first place then? Why not have a bigger GPU at higher clock speeds? And the reason for this is simply money. The smaller the GPU, the more of them fit onto one single wafer. On these older 200mm wafers, a 111 square millimeter GPU, you'd be able to fit around 222 of these GPUs onto this single wafer. Now with this smaller 81 square millimeter GPU, you can now fit 307 of them onto one single wafer. Now each wafer has a set cost, so obviously the more GPUs you can fit onto one wafer, the more money you make. And that is why a company would much rather sell you a smaller GPU, even though that obviously means you get less performance compared to a larger GPU on the same process. In this case, NV15 launched in the year 2000 as a GeForce 2 GTS graphics card, with a performance increase of 46.2% over the GeForce 256 DDR. Over at AnandTech, Anand himself said, "At close to $350, it's a tough call if you currently have the DDR GeForce." While over at Tom's, the conclusion was the GeForce 2 GTS has left a mixed kind of impression, and that the benchmark results showed you how few applications offer a meaningful improvement from switching from the GeForce to the GeForce 2. It's safe to say that the GeForce 2 did not receive a ringing endorsement, and it really all came down to that rather small 46.2% increase. A few months later, Nvidia launched the GeForce 2 Ultra. 250 MHz core clock, that is 25% faster, and also a large increase in the memory clock. And over at Tom's conclusion, this Ultra version of the GeForce 2 chip is finally the product that they expected when Nvidia released the GeForce 2 GTS less than 4 months ago. However, it comes at a mind-blowing $499 US. While over at AnandTech, once again, Anand himself said, at $500, it's going to be very difficult to justify purchasing the GeForce 2 Ultra. It was 38.3% faster than the GeForce 2 GTS, and this Ultra version was twice as fast as the old GeForce 256 DDR. It was clearly a fast product, but rather than giving the Ultra from the start, Nvidia had launched a much slower part before releasing their faster part at a much higher price. And regardless of the great performance that Ultra had, they simply could not recommend anyone spend $500 on it. $500 in 2000 would be $710 today. So next up was of course the GeForce 3 series. This time Nvidia went back to only having the one GPU, which they codenamed NV20. The size of this GPU was 128mm squared, with 57 million transistors, now manufactured on TSMC's 150nm process. The first card that we saw was simply called the GeForce 3, and it came with a 68.2% performance increase over the GeForce 2 GTS, not the Ultra, the GTS. And over at AnandTech, Anand said that he was very impressed with the GeForce 3 and the technology behind it. However, in spite of that, they simply cannot recommend the GeForce 3 at this point. The main reason being, at a $500 asking price, once again, it quickly loses its appeal. A bit later on again in the year, the GeForce 3 Ti 500 was launched with a 20% higher core clock speed and once again a respective increase in performance. Nvidia's fourth GeForce series quickly became a favourite with enthusiasts. The real GeForce GPU was codenamed NV25, again built on the same 150nm process as the GeForce 3, with a slightly larger die size of 142 square millimeters and 63 million transistors. And in 2002, the famous GeForce TI graphics cards launched, with the flagship being the GeForce TI 4600. Performance was 60.6% faster than the GeForce 3, and with a launch price of $400, Nvidia was sitting on a very impressive GPU. Now, I covered the GeForce 4 series in another video, Innovation versus Rebranding, so feel free to check that one out after you've watched this. The most interesting thing here though is that ATI, the only real competitor that Nvidia still had, seemed to be relatively unimpressed, and this led Anand to speculate that perhaps ATI's new GPU, the R300, could just be that much better. And although this is an Nvidia video, it is of course impossible to completely leave out ATI. And Anand's speculation was right, because the Radeon 9700 Pro, based on the R300 GPU, was faster than anything we had seen so far. 110 million transistors of joy, and it was built on the same 150nm process of the GeForce 4 Ti. Yet ATI had crammed in many more million transistors, and one of the reasons for this was, of course, it was a much larger die size. Over at the Tech Report's conclusion, they said that the Radeon 9700 Pro is the culmination of an era and the beginning of something new. But what they didn't realise at this time is that the R300 had kicked off an arms race, and graphics cards would never be the same again. Now, the main reason for mentioning the Radeon 700 Pro R300 is that it had a massive bearing on what happened next for GeForce, and the GeForce 5 or GeForce FX series, which is generally recognised as one of the worst GPU series of all time. And understanding why that became the case should be quite enlightening. The original GPU was codenamed NV30, and it was a 200 square millimeter GPU with 125 million transistors, very similar to R300, and a GPU size of around 200 square millimeters. And it was built on TSMC's 130nm process. And the first of the FX series cards was the FX 5800 Ultra, which came in at 65.4% faster than the GeForce TI 4600. Now remember, the TI 4600 was a very well received graphics card, especially by enthusiasts, and it was only 60.6% faster than the previous generation GeForce 3. So now, 1 year later, 2003, the FX 5800 Ultra launches with an even better increase in performance over the TI, and what's more, it only cost $300. But according to Anand, in his conclusion, the word impressive isn't what we'd use to describe it. It's an improvement over the TI 4600 without a doubt, as you just saw, but it did not place Nvidia back in the position of dominance, which is what everybody was expecting. And in actual fact, it just lost to the older Radeon 9700 Pro, which had already well and truly taken care of the GeForce 4 Ti, but had now also defeated Nvidia's newest flagship, the FX 5800 Ultra. So even though Nvidia had made a good leap forward, 68+% had released a graphics card at $300, well down on the $450, $500 of previous flagships, it was pretty much pilloried in the press. It was just soundly beaten by the older Radeon. But the interesting thing here is, a few months later on in the year, once again Nvidia released the FX 5900 and the FX 5950. They had now just taken over the 9700 and 9800 Pro. Nvidia just about back in the lead again, but it came at a cost of high power draw and a very, very noisy cooler. The FX series cards were the original hot and loud. But the truly interesting thing is, this all came from competition. ATI had shocked Nvidia by releasing such a large GPU in the R300. And as you saw, Nvidia was kind of treading water. They would release a slower card and then a faster card later on. And this was basically their plan with the FX 5800. But they were completely caught off guard with the performance of the 9700 Pro. But as you probably know, development timeframes for GPUs stretch over many years. Back then it was probably 1 or 2 years. And Nvidia would have planned this 5800 as their high-end GPU, and they simply had to release it. But as soon as they caught wind of the R300, the size of the R300, they were also forced to release a faster graphics card. In this case, NV35, the FX 5900 or the FX 5950 had a much larger memory bus size. The combination of a 256-bit memory bus, a more efficient architecture, and more mature drivers almost saved the FX series. But at the $499 price tag, 5900 Ultra is extremely hard to justify. But the same can be said about the Radeon 9800 Pro, because it was also $500, and yet the 5900 Ultra did outperform it in a number of tests. And I'm sure you can see that this is the difference that having competition makes. And it didn't take long before we saw yet more fruits of this competition, as Nvidia launched their GeForce 6 series with their NV40 GPU and a, at the time, mammoth die size of 287 square millimeters and a massive 222 million transistors. Still on the same 130nm process of the previous FX series, the famous GeForce 6800 Ultra graphics card in 2004, and a massive 121.1% performance increase over the FX 5800. And even though the card launched at the $500 price point, the GeForce 6800 had set some pretty solid standards, so the price was not that much of a factor. A massive increase in performance was finally worth the $500 price point. Anantech still weren't crowning any kings yet though, because ATI would soon be making their mark. And even though Nvidia had made massive leaps in performance, ATI continued to make similar leaps, and the competition remained fierce, which brought even bigger die sizes, with Nvidia's new GeForce 7 series, and also a break from tradition as the GPU codenames moved away from NV to G, the new G70 GPU, 333 square millimeters with 302 million transistors, all on TSMC's new 110nm process. The flagship launched as the GeForce 7800 GTX, and a 72% increase in performance over the 6800 Ultra. The GeForce 7800 GTX really was a force with which to be reckoned, but it also came with a less pleasant side: the price, launching at a solid $600, which in 2005 would be around the same as $751 in 2017. 1 year later, Nvidia launched the 7900 GTX, which again, a faster version of the 7800, faster memory, faster core clock, but as you can see here, ATI had not let up either, and both companies went on to release a slew of faster cards, slightly faster than the previous, in order to leapfrog the other. That is how close it was back in 2005, 2006. But at the end of 2006, Nvidia did something that would change the game forever. Nvidia launched a series which was the biggest game changer since ATI had launched the R300 series many years previously. I am of course talking about the GeForce 8 series. It could be said that I give Nvidia a bit of a rough time, but credit where credit is due, and with the GeForce 8 series, Nvidia deserves all the credit in the world. With the launch of their new G80 GPU at a mammoth 484 square millimeters, a mind-boggling 681 million transistors, that's way more than the previous G70, and manufactured on TSMC's new 90nm process, launching as the flagship 8800 GTX and an incredible 130% performance increase over the previous GTX, the 7800. Nvidia simply deserves massive credit for having the balls to release such a massive, mammoth GPU on a new process. And over at Hexus, it was rather clear that the G80 is something more than a bit special. And over at Anantech, where the sheer performance they were able to attain because of the G80 was breathtaking. G80 was a gigantic leap from the previous generation of GPUs, akin to what they saw with the Radeon 9700 Pro. And all of a sudden, the $600 price tag was not that big of an issue because the performance warranted it. And the magnificence of the GeForce 8 series was only matched by Nvidia's ridiculous segmentation of it, which culminated in the launch of the 8800 Ultra at a minimum $830. This was effectively still the same 8800 GTX, with a slightly bumped core clock speed and faster memory. And it's safe to say that regardless of its performance and its position as the world's fastest graphics card, the conclusion over at Anantech was crystal clear. The Nvidia GeForce 8800 Ultra is an utter waste of money. They're all for higher performance, and they don't mind higher prices, but it is ridiculous to charge an exorbitant amount of money for something that doesn't offer any benefit over a product already on the market. $830 isn't the issue. In fact, they would love to see a graphics card worth that money, but the 8800 Ultra just isn't it. Any of you watching this who own a GeForce Titan may want to take note. Now obviously we waited with bated breath on ATI's response, convinced that yet again we would see these two great companies going head to head, but sadly that didn't quite materialise, as ATI's massive R600 GPU massively disappointed. It wasn't as big as G80, it was only 420 square millimeters, but it had severe problems with power and obviously temperatures, and it just wasn't very fast. In fact, it was a terrible GPU, by far and away ATI's worst, and that simply meant that Nvidia had never been further ahead than what they were after the launch of G80. So with that in mind, did they go for the kill? Did they really try to turn the screw on ATI? The answer to that was, of course, no. They instead just shrunk and rebranded G80 over and over. So many 8 series cards with confusing names and performance that was really no better. In actual fact, the 9 series flagship was the 9800 GTX, and it was actually slower than the GeForce 8800 Ultra, and was only 7% faster than the 8 series launch flagship, the 8800 GTX. The 9 series, the G92 GPU, was built on 65nm and was effectively a die-shrunk G80. 324 square millimeters and 754 million transistors. So no, Nvidia yet again did not go for the kill, and in fact Nvidia was just giving the impression that it's resting on its laurels and giving us just enough to get by. Was that really the best that they could do 17 months after the 8800 GTX? Now again, I covered the 9 series in my innovation versus rebranding video, and it's safe to say that Nvidia did not get away with this in the press. The press were highly critical of their rebranding and what was perceived as a lack of trying, and AMD, who by then had acquired ATI, were keen to point this out in their slide, Innovation versus Rebranding, where I took the title of the video from. So again, feel free to check that one out. Of course, that wasn't the best that they could do, and they were working on a brand new GPU architecture. And that series had moved on to GeForce 200, codenamed GT200, and coming in at an enormous 576 square millimeters and 1.4 billion transistors on TSMC's 65nm process. So it's actually on the same process as the 9800 series, and this is what made sense by now, because launching a massive GPU on a brand new process was a recipe for disaster. The smart thing to do would be launch a smaller one first. The flagship GTX 280 came in at 69.6% faster than the 8800 GTX, so over 60% faster than the 9800 GTX, which had just been released. And while there was no question that Nvidia has built a very impressive chip with the GT200, the GeForce GTX 280 is simply overpriced for the performance it delivers. Now that price was $650, and once again I covered GT200 in one of my better videos, The GPU War is Over. This period here between 2008 and 2011 was one of the more interesting periods in GPU history. And the reason for that was ATI had declared that they would no longer be pushing as many transistors as possible into giant packages. In other words, they would no longer be building massive GPUs in order to do battle with Nvidia. They simply couldn't afford to do it any longer. And the expectation here was that they simply could not compete. But that's not really what happened, and the GPU War is Over video covers that period. As a bit of a spoiler, you can probably tell that ATI did in fact compete very, very well with this massive GPU, with a much, much smaller GPU. And one of the more interesting points about that video was how the GTX 260, which was a cut down version of this massive GT200, the initial GTX 260 had 25% of the GPU cut down in order to fill that market segment. But that meant that they lost to the ATI 4870, and a few months later they were forced to release a bigger GTX 260 in order to compete. So keep that in mind for a bit later on in this video. But again, you're looking at a 60% plus improvement in performance, but Anand and Derek were simply not prepared to recommend it, basically because of the price, which in 2008 would come in at $738 in 2017. Next for Nvidia was their GeForce 400 series, which was a series plagued by problems and delays. At this point, AMD had held a commanding performance per watt lead. Finally, with the launch of the GF100 GPU, another absolutely mammoth 529 square millimeter GPU, 3 billion transistors, and built on TSMC's 40nm process in 2010, the GeForce 400 series finally launched with the GTX 480, with performance that was only 53% faster than the GeForce GTX 280. Was it worth the delays and the long wait? No, probably not. It was in fact a very hot, extremely power-hungry GPU, which while faster than AMD's flagship, the 5870, was much, much larger and actually used more power than the dual GPU 5970. So that would be two of AMD's flagship 5870 GPUs on one board using less power than one Nvidia GTX 480. Well, of course, still being quite a bit faster. Fermi was just an absolute disaster for Nvidia, and it is one that should have set them back many, many years, at a time when they were already toiling against AMD. But as the GPU War is Over video showed, even with these terrible GPUs, Nvidia was still making money back then, whereas AMD wasn't. A few months later, and a few respins at TSMC, Nvidia had fixed a lot of the worst things about Fermi. And with their new GTX 5 series, the GTX 580 was faster and more power efficient than the GTX 480. Fixing their disastrous previous architecture was enough to earn them mild but well-earned praise. But as Ryan Smith at Anantech pointed out in his conclusion, the GTX 580 was not the true next generation successor to the GTX 480. Now, what actually happened here was, Fermi was so incredibly inefficient and it had such poor yields at TSMC that Nvidia could not even release the full GPU to start with. So the flagship GTX 480 began its life as a cut-down GPU. Up until this point, the GTX 280, your 8800 GTXs and all that, you got the full GPU. These massive GPUs, you got that full GPU as a gamer, right off the bat. But with Fermi, they had to release a cut down version because the full version simply wouldn't yield and the power usage was through the roof. And this was one of the biggest fixes with the GTX 580. You now got the full GPU, slightly higher clock speeds, improved power, but it was only 17% faster than the GTX 480. Now back then in 2010, enthusiasts still mattered. And as I've mentioned in previous videos, enthusiasts tend to live in their own little bubble. Most of us knew that the GTX 580 was simply a fixed 480, but how many of the average graphics cards buyers knew that? And how many thought that this was just another new series? When you think about this, let's say you bought a GTX 280, 2008, but you're not paying that much attention to the graphics market. Maybe you never heard about the GTX 480, or you simply heard about it in passing. Now suddenly this GTX 580 arrives on the scene, and you suddenly feel that your GTX 280 is 3 series behind, when in actual fact the GTX 580 would only be about 70% faster overall. Now you think about that, because a couple of years previous to this, you would be expecting a 70% increase series to series, at least. Those are the kind of increases we saw between the 6800 Ultra, the 7800 GTX, and so on. But now Nvidia had jumped 3 series in numbers with only around a 70% increase in performance, and they weren't called out in it because enthusiasts, and that includes us guys reviewing, we are caught in our own bubble making assumptions that everybody else is an enthusiast and following this closely. But this is simply not the case, as you will see in part 2 of this video.